In 1988, the Kamara family had everything. A father, who was a teacher. A mother, who sold goods at the waterside market in Monrovia. 4 children. The eldest, Fanta, just 16 years old, already dreaming of university. A small cement house with a zinc roof in Sincor. A garden where pepper and cassava grew. A life that was ordinary, modest, and good. By the end of that year, they had nothing. No house, no market, no garden. Just the clothes on their backs, the children they carried, and a road that led away from everything they had ever known. This is the story of the Kamara family. Of war, loss, survival, and eventually of triumph. To understand what the Kamaras lost, you have to first understand what they had. Monrovia in the late 1980s was a city of contradictions. Founded by freed American slaves who returned to Africa in the 1800s, Liberia called itself the oldest republic in Africa. It had a university, a port, a rubber industry, connections to the United States that made many Liberians believe, truly believe, that their country was protected. Special, untouchable. Emmanuel Kamara, the father, had grown up in Nimba County in the north, the heartland of the Geo people. He had walked to school as a child, earned his teaching certificate, and moved to Monrovia as a young man full of ambition. There he met Musu, a sharp-tongued, warm-hearted woman from Bomi County who could negotiate the price of anything at the market and made the best pepper soup in the neighborhood. They married young, they built slowly. They had 4 children. Fanta, the eldest at 16, Joseph 13, little Agnes 8, and baby David, who had just turned 3. Life was not rich, but it was theirs. Emmanuel taught mathematics at a government school. Musu ran her market stall 6 days a week, trading dried fish, palm oil, and the small imported goods that Monrovia's market women were famous for. On Sundays they went to church. The children went to school. Emmanuel grew a small garden behind the house. They had no reason to believe that any of it could disappear, but on Christmas Eve 1989, it began. Charles Taylor crossed into Liberia from Côte d'Ivoire on December 24, 1989. His rebels, a force called the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, were mostly young men from Nimba County, the same county Emmanuel Kamara had grown up in. At first, in Monrovia, people thought it would pass. Wars had threatened Liberia before. Coups had come and gone. The city buzzed with rumors, but most people stayed home, stayed calm, and waited. But this war did not pass. By 1990, the fighting had reached Monrovia, and it was unlike anything Liberians had ever seen. Armed factions multiplied. At one point, 11 different armed groups were fighting simultaneously across the country. The violence had no logic, no rules. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Checkpoints appeared on every road, manned by boys, some barely teenagers, with guns bigger than their bodies. Emmanuel first knew something was truly wrong the morning he walked to school and found it locked. No students, no teachers. A note on the door that said nothing except one word, closed. He walked home. That same week, gunfire began in the neighborhood. Not distant, close. The kind of sound that makes you grab your children and lie flat on the floor. Musu packed a bag that night. She didn't know where they were going. She packed what a mother packs when she doesn't know when she is coming back. The children's documents, a change of clothes each, her small savings rolled in a cloth, and the photograph from their wedding. She left the pepper soup on the stove. She never went back for it. The Kamaras joined a river of people moving out of Monrovia, thousands, tens of thousands. Families with bundles on their heads, babies strapped to backs, elderly people helped along by younger ones, a mass of human beings moving away from the sound of guns. They could not go north. The fighting was heaviest there. East was dangerous. They moved toward the Ivorian border, toward Côte d'Ivoire, which in those days was still the jewel of West Africa. Stable, prosperous, welcoming. The Ivorian president had called Liberian refugees brothers in distress and opened the border. The journey took weeks, on foot, through bush paths to avoid the checkpoints. Emmanuel carried David on his back for most of it. Musu carried the bag. Fanta, 16 years old and suddenly older than her years, held Agnes by the hand and did not let go for the entire journey. They ate what they could find. Mangoes from trees along the road, cassava offered by villagers. Sometimes nothing. Joseph, 13 years old, was quiet for most of the journey. But one night, huddled under a tree as rain fell, he asked his father quietly, "Pa, are we ever going back?" Emmanuel looked at his son for a long time before he answered. "Yes," he said, "we are going back, but first we survive." They crossed into Côte d'Ivoire in early 1992. They arrived with nothing, exactly nothing. The UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, had set up camps for Liberian refugees in the western regions of Côte d'Ivoire, near the town of Guiglo. The Kamaras were registered, given a tent, and handed rations, rice, oil, dried beans. It was not a life, but it was survival. The camp was a city of the displaced. Liberians from every county, every tribe, every background, all reduced to the same status. Refugee, the word that erases everything that came before it. Emmanuel struggled deeply in the early months. This was a man who had built his identity on being a provider, a teacher, a man of standing in his community. In the camp, he was nobody. He sat for hours staring at nothing. It was Musu who held the family together. Musu, who had always been the engine of the household, threw herself into camp life with a ferocity that surprised even those who knew her. She learned where the best rations were distributed. She organized the women in their section of the camp. She started a small trade, exchanging rations for small items, building a tiny informal economy from nothing. Within 6 months, the Kamara tent was known as the place people came when they needed something. Fanta, meanwhile, had discovered there was a school in the camp, organized by NGO volunteers and run by refugee teachers. She threw herself into it. She had missed an entire year of school during the flight from Monrovia, and she was determined to catch up. She studied by lantern light when the generator went off. She helped the younger children with their lessons during the day. Joseph found it harder. Teenage boys in the camp had few outlets. Some drifted toward trouble. Emmanuel watched his son carefully, worried. He began teaching mathematics informally, gathering a small group of boys under a tree every morning, teaching them with sticks in the dirt when there was no paper. Joseph became his most faithful student. Agnes, 8 years old, adapted the way children sometimes do, with a resilience that broke her parents' hearts because it meant she was growing up too fast. She learned Dioula, the local language, faster than anyone in the family. She made friends among the Ivorian village children near the camp. Little David, too young to understand any of it, simply grew up. The years passed. 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. The news from Liberia came in waves. A ceasefire, then fighting again. Elections in 1997. Charles Taylor himself won the presidency, which gave some Liberians a bitter, desperate hope that perhaps the war was finally over. Some refugees returned. The Kamaras waited. They had learned not to rush hope. By 1999, they had been in Côte d'Ivoire for 7 years. Fanta was now 23. She had completed her schooling in the camp and was helping to teach the younger children. Joseph was 20. Agnes was 15. David was 10 and had never known Liberia except through his parents' stories. Then came the news. The Second Liberian Civil War had broken out. They would not be going home yet. It was a church pastor in the camp who told Fanta about it. The United States Diversity Visa Lottery, a program that gave people from countries with low immigration rates to the US a chance, a random chance, to apply for a green card. Legal permanent residency in America. Fanta almost didn't apply. What were the chances? Millions of people entered every year. It was luck. Pure luck. But the pastor said something she never forgot. You cannot win a lottery. You do not enter. So she applied. She filled out the form carefully, submitted it, and put it out of her mind. She had learned in the camp that hope was a resource to be spent carefully. You did not pour it into things you could not control. 2 years later, a letter came. She had won. The night Fanta told her family, her mother, Musu, sat down on the ground outside their tent and wept. Not sad tears, the other kind. The tears of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Emmanuel held his daughter's hands for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You go first. You go, you build, and then you bring us." Fanta Kamara landed in the United States in 2001. She had $200, a suitcase, and the address of a distant cousin in Minnesota she had never met. America was nothing like she had imagined. It was colder than she thought possible. The cousin's apartment was small and crowded. The first job she found was cleaning offices at night. She went home every morning, slept a few hours, and she sent money home every month. Even when she had almost nothing, she sent something. She enrolled in a community college, then transferred, then worked and studied simultaneously for years, the way immigrants do, the way people do, when they are not just building a life for themselves, but for everyone who stayed behind. Back in Côte d'Ivoire, the family finally returned to Liberia in 2003, when the war ended. Emmanuel went back to teaching. Musu reopened a small trade. They returned to Monrovia to find their old house occupied by strangers and their neighborhood change beyond recognition. But they were home. The Kamara family story did not end in a refugee camp. Joseph eventually followed Fanta to America on a family visa. He became an engineer. Agnes went to university in Monrovia and became a nurse. David, little David, who was 3 years old when they fled and grew up in a refugee camp, David became a teacher, just like his father. And Emmanuel and Musu. They stayed in Liberia, in a new house, not the old one that was gone, but a new one, built slowly, brick by brick, with money sent home by their children across the ocean. On the wall of that house, Musu hung one thing, the wedding photograph she had packed the night she left the pepper soup on the stove. Some people call it a refugee story. The Kamaras call it their story. And every family that has ever packed a bag in the middle of the night, walked a road they didn't choose, and survived long enough to rebuild, they know exactly what that means. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of African resilience, survival, and triumph. And drop a comment below. Do you have a family story like the Kamaras? We want to hear it.